Hi, folks, and welcome to the final mini lecture of the week. We're going to examine an environmental catastrophe unprecedented in American history, the Dust Bowl. This is a lecture about faith and about unintended consequences. It's about hubris, but also about uncontrollable environmental factors. It's a question of how humans, specifically Anglo-Americans, viewed their environment and how those views changed. And it's a disaster that's a result of agricultural policy, settler colonialism, and optimism. In the late 1920s, the Great Plains east of the Rocky Mountain front began experiencing a sustained drought. Years of lower than expected rainfall imperiled the dry land agricultural economy of the Great Plains, and the Depression only exacerbated this, driving commodity prices down and pushing farmers to grow and produce on a larger scale. But we know from studying the history of the West after the Civil War that these farmers had to get out to the Great Plains, and that a series of other factors contributed to the Dust Bowl. And many of these factors are foundational in the Anglo-American settlement of the plains, but also in government policies and practices since the Civil War. Next week, we're going to watch a very quaint and old-timey documentary on the Dust Bowl, and hopefully this lecture provides an introduction and some context. Before Anglo-American settlement, the Great Plains were a short-grass prairie ecosystem, a complex grassland dependent on a number of species of grasses and forbs, and the munching, digging, rooting, and pooping of the shaggy American bison. Rainfall is generally pretty low in the region, and most climate models call it a semi-arid region with low annual precipitation. Early explorers called the region, quote, the Great American Desert, due to its aridity and the fact that they hadn't quite discovered Utah and Nevada yet. The diversity of the grasses on the plains locked the rich topsoil below and anchored the landscape. They also fed the rich animal populations of the plains, supporting huge herds of bison, numerous deer, elk, wolves, bears, birds, amphibians, other animals. Native American groups, especially the Sioux and the Comanche, depended on the horse and the bison for their lifeways, but also proved to be a formidable military force in the plains. These societies adapted to the ecology based on a low rainfall and a diverse ecosystem of grass, able to support a lot of ungulates that transformed grass into protein and power. Recall for a minute the settlement of the Great Plains and of the West. Anglo-Americans had been pushing west for decades, following an insatiable thirst for lands and not much caring about how it was acquired or who was dispossessed. As a means of driving economic growth during the Civil War, the U.S. pushed the Homestead Act, offering lots of relatively cheap land for settlement and encouraging agriculture on the plains. The bison died en masse at the hands of bison hunters, and cattle moved in to occupy part of their ecological niche. And more homesteads popped up on the plains. The fundamental idea behind the settlement and agricultural exploitation of the plains was the idea, the notion, the dream, that rain would follow the plow. It was a faith of economic progress, that cultivating the plains through hard work would lead to a climatological change in precipitation patterns. And it was based on decades of higher than average precipitation over the plains, right as the Homestead Act began encouraging widespread settlement, and the railroads offered connections to the markets. Great impetuses for settling the plains. The idea was that by breaking the plains, by getting rid of the uneconomical shortgrass and replacing it with wheat or other grains, that the Great Plains could be transformed into the breadbasket for the feeding of industrial America and the modern world. The idea that these lands could feed more than bison and Native Americans, but also the bold idea that agrarian democracy could be a foundation of the political order. Now, this image here is an image of shortgrass, different types of shortgrass and their root structures. The average shortgrass complex had a root system that extended feet below the plains and formed dense mats of roots. You can take a look at this graph of root structures, and over here, this little blurb that, I don't know, looks kind of like Hitler's mustache, is Kentucky bluegrass, the standard lawn grass that is planted widely, whereas the other ones are endemic grasses of the Great Plains. You can just see the difference in the depth of the root structure. These roots helped control soil saturation and water levels, but they also made the shortgrass prairie very difficult to dig into. If you've ever encountered sawgrass roots while gardening or doing yard work, you know that they can be the bane of any garden due to their creeping and weaving. Early homesteaders on the prairie called the difficult work breaking the land, because they literally had to break apart the thick web of roots to expose the soils below. They often built their houses out of the sod that they pulled off of the broken land. The grasslands were broken. The complex web of grass roots, limited moisture, and bison was replaced by commodity grasses such as wheat and by cows. High precipitation levels and a thrumming market for American agricultural products reinforced these ideas. American effort and faith could transform what was seen as useless or savage into something else, something profitable and controllable. And the rain would cooperate. And it worked for a while. Mechanization of agriculture enabled further acres of plains to be broken, as mechanical plows could perform the back-breaking labor on a steady diet of coal and petroleum. A rising demand for U.S. agricultural products stirred further production and further breaking of the plains. We saw how American wheat fed the destitute civilians of war-torn Europe under the direction of Hoover's Commission of Relief in Belgium. And the Russian Revolution furthered the world's dependence on the American breadbasket, as grain production in Russia dropped during the chaos of the Bolshevik Revolution. It was a combination of the transformation of the land from the bison commons to cattle and wheat, the faith and the techno-progressive notion that rain follows the plow, and the expansion of the settlement and commodity production on the shortgrass prairies that set the stage for disaster. It was ideas of bounty, of transformation, of progress, and of democracy. The idea that hardworking individuals working the land could transform the great American desert into a garden and into an Eden that would change the climate and lead to continued agricultural productivity and prosperity based on individual land holdings. If anything, the Dust Bowl represents the failure of excess optimism. The decades of above-average rainfall came to an end in the late 1920s. It had been a pretty good decade for the Great Plains commodity production, but American farmers were also falling for the other instabilities of the American economy. They were too efficient at producing grains, and their overproduction helped drive down the very wheat prices that they depended on. They borrowed heavily, whether to finance mechanization or to keep the banks from foreclosing on their properties. But debt was and remains a substantial part of agricultural practices. And then the wind came. The dry soils lifted into the air and formed massive dust storms. The sky blackened. Furthering the apocalyptic vibe, plagues of locusts and grasshoppers swarmed other parts of the plains, devastating crops and leaving miles-wide swaths of destruction in their wake. The winds drove the soils of the plains into the air. This dry, desiccated topsoil was the result of millennia grass growth and death, of bison and cattle grazing and excrement, of the complex interactions of the shortgrass prairie ecosystem. It was incredibly rich topsoil before it dried out and blew away. It was also the source of hopes and dreams of dryland farmers. Their soil, their lifestyle, their means, their abilities to produce for their families and their country, their hard work and their dreams. It blew away. It formed massive dust clouds that blew east. Dirt from the Dust Bowl landed in New York City and on the decks of ships out to sea in the Atlantic Ocean. Gallows humor is an interesting phenomenon. It's that cold joke that points out the absurdity in a deadly situation, or the utter irony of otherwise unfunny circumstances. It's a coping mechanism that offers momentary relief to the powerless. In the case of the Dust Bowl, the witnesses labeled the worst days of high winds and dust as Black Sunday, both for the appearance of the dust clouds, but also as a mockery of the market crash. Stockbrokers could complain about diminishing dividends in 1929, but in 1933, farmers saw their whole farms blow away. Their wealth was in the soil, and that soil went with the wind. In 1934, red snow fell in New England, dust from Kansas and Oklahoma. Eastern cities had to turn on the streetlights in the middle of the day in the midst of dust storms. The rich soils of the plains rose into the air and fell to the east and into the Atlantic Ocean. Black Sunday, indeed. I'm going to conclude this lecture here. I really hope you enjoy the Thanksgiving break and the short documentaries selected, and I'll see you in the forums before we leave, and then after when we return.